Well, hello, and welcome to this weekly edition of our Wednesday night devotional. We're going to be looking at a passage in James chapter 1. So if you have a Bible and you want to turn to James chapter 1, we'll be looking at verses 9 through 11. So James writes, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower fades and its beauty perishes, so also will the rich fade away in the midst of his pursuits." So last time we looked at the topic of wisdom. This week James transitions to the topic of riches and wealth. And this is something that James is going to revisit multiple times in his book. It's an important theme for him, partly because we can guess that many of the people that read this letter originally were poor. We imagine that many of the people were Jewish Christians, and they were probably, we can imagine, excluded from certain things from the Jewish community. They may have been uninvited to feasts and social gatherings, perhaps even business transactions. We also know that there was a famine in this time, in the mid-40s, and if it concurs with the time that this book was written, we can imagine that many of the people were facing severe hardships, and many of the trials that they were facing were probably through these kinds of economic struggles. They were being persecuted by the rich. They were being dragged into court. And so the people hearing this letter are imagining, what about me? What if I'm poor? What does that mean? And what kind of standing do I have before God? So let's look at first the poor, verse 9. It says, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation." So you would think that boasting is something that we shouldn't be doing on matters of rich and poor. But James says it's actually the antidote. So the poor are supposed to boast in their exaltation. But what is this exaltation exactly? If you trace this word and similar words in Greek, it often refers in the New Testament to a kind of heavenly exaltation, usually when Christ ascends. If you look at Ephesians 2:6, it says, "He has raised us up with him and seated us with him in heavenly places." So this idea that Christ is raised and exalted, but we as believers are now sharing in that exaltation, which means that right now the poorest people in the world, if they are Christians, occupy this high, heavenly, exalted place of honor, as opposed to people that aren't Christians. You may think of Philippians 2:20, which says that we're citizens of heaven, which means that we have dual citizenship. We're citizens of heaven and we're citizens of earth. We can occupy a very high place in our heavenly citizenship, but we may not necessarily be viewed highly by the world. And what God is saying is that how you are viewed by the world standards, namely your riches, is something that counts very little. It counts as not even at all for your heavenly status. This is not to say that only the poor can be saved, but that the poor are especially precious. Historically, Christianity has spread most rapidly through poorer communities. And why not? Because this is a message that basically says God loves you. The God who created the whole world loves you, died for you, has a special place of honor for the poor. And not only that, but is going to right every wrong. Every injustice ever perpetrated against the poor will be corrected. And he says that those people that are persecuting you will not escape the wrath and judgment of God. That's the message that the poor are hearing and they're delighting in. And it's this already but not yet reality. In the one sense, the poor are right now in the highest position in God's kingdom, this upside down, invisible kingdom. But there's a greater reality to come. I think of The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, which, if you're not familiar, it's a creative picture of heaven and hell. It's not meant to be exactly literal, but there are these different vignettes and there are these characters in heaven and hell that this narrator meets. And at one point, he's in heaven and he sees this woman and this procession following her. And he turns to his guide and asks, he thinks that she's somebody famous. He says, "Who is she?" And the guide says, "She's nobody, or on earth she was nobody." And basically says, it's because fame on earth and fame here work differently. So there's a future reality that the poor will be able to experience. Because the kind of faith that they had, that they struggled through, is a kind of faith that has more eternal value and glory than the kind of life of self-satisfaction and seeking one's own desires that the rich fall into. So what are the rich supposed to do then? Well, the rich are supposed to boast in their humiliation because, like a flower of grass, he'll pass away. So what does this mean? Are all the rich condemned? Some people have wondered whether this passage is really referring to unbelievers. Most of my reading has suggested no. The real idea here is James is saying that the riches and benefits that the rich enjoy now will not matter at all. They have no eternal significance. And it's kind of ironic to say that they boast in their humiliation. James is clearly quoting Isaiah chapter 40, which says, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord stands forever. So James is likening a rich person to a beautiful flower that looks great for a moment, but then the sun scorches away. In an instant, it's going to be gone, and it's all going to be taken away from them. And this is just obvious, right? The rich cannot take their wealth with them. This is all through the Old Testament, all through the wisdom literature. We accumulate wealth because we think it's going to give us eternal value and significance, not remembering that in an instance it will be taken away. It might be taken away from us this life, but it will most certainly be taken away when we die or when Christ returns. And so this is not to say that having wealth or working hard is necessarily a bad thing. It's the idea that of having the identity of a rich man counts against us in God's kingdom. Or you may say, working hard can be used actually to benefit God's kingdom. But to pursue riches and pursue things selfishly are what hurts us in the end of the day. So what are we supposed to do? If you're watching this video, by global standards, you could probably say you were probably somewhat well off. I imagine many people in Bethel's congregation, even the poorest among us, are probably rich by global standards. I heard a story of a young man who stayed with his family in America, and after his time here, they asked the young man, so what stood out to you most? And he said two things, grocery stores and the fact that everybody has a house for their car, which you kind of stop and you think about those things that we take for granted. So again, for many of us, it's worth stopping and looking at how we stand globally. We may feel that we're poor because we're comparing ourselves to other people in probably the most wealthy country that's ever existed. So it's partly thinking of that perspective, but being thankful for the things we have and remembering that it's a gift from God. We are called to not pursue things selfishly, but to love others with our wealth. And I think the real goal here is that the rich are saved through, not that they're saved for works necessarily, but that the rich add a kind of eternal significance in their wealth when they identify with the poor. If you turn to Job 29, there's a really important passage where Job is talking about the things that he did. And if you remember Job, we had it from God himself that Job was an exceptionally righteous man, yet he was very wealthy. So what does he do? We'll turn to Job 29. Job says a few things about himself. And this was an important passage for understanding how the Israelites viewed a kind of righteousness that cared for the poor and the marginalized. So Job 29:15 says, I was eyes to the blind and the feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I searched out the cause of him whom I did not know. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous, and I made him drop his prey from his teeth. And then turn over to 31, verse 16. It says, if I have withheld anything from the poor that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten of it. For from my youth the fatherless grew up with me as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, and if he is not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless because I saw my help in the gate, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken for its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. So Job isn't just living in a gated community writing checks to the poor around him. It sounds as though he's actively engaged with them. He's inviting them into his home. He's giving them food to eat at his table. He's giving them his possessions. And James is saying, shame on me if I have not done these things. And I think the idea it means for us now, sitting in this unique time in history, in an extremely wealthy country, is to think about what are the things that God has given you, and how can you use those to reach out to people who do not have the same access to the same things? How can we fight for them? How can we fight the injustices of the world, as James did? How can we share our belongings? And how can we identify with the poor? Again, it's not a matter of getting rid of our riches or stopping making money. It's stopping the identity of being a rich person and instead identifying with the poor around you. So I hope you enjoyed this weekly devotional.